Hello everybody and welcome back to more of our player guide series. My name is Zen and I'm going to be walking you through our healer guide today. In the previous video we talked about tanking, and that's what I do in the game. I tank and sometimes I DPS on all my ults, but what I don't do is I don't heal within Star Wars. The reasoning for this is back in the day, I used to heal. That's actually how I got started with raiding. As soon as I hit 60 in Warcraft back in the vanilla days, I got invited to a raid group because people knew that I was a pretty decent healer, and I kind of blossomed there and got into a lot of competitive groups while healing, but I don't heal in Star Wars. However, that being said, you don't necessarily have to heal in Star Wars to know how to heal. You know, having a basic knowledge of the concepts about healing will help you effectively heal in any game. That goes for just about any role, though. Whether you know a lot about a role or a little, if you know the basic stuff, you can pretty much do it in any game and you'll be able to do it well. And that's the important part. That's the reason we're making these role guides for the intermediate series. And it is definitely an intermediate guide. Some information here will be relevant to some of you and some of it won't. If you're an advanced healer and you've been healing hardcore raids for, I don't know, 6-7 years, throughout several games, you probably aren't going to get anything out of this. But what you may get if you're a, less experienced player is the ability to heal more effectively, and you might actually see a pretty significant change in your playstyle over the next month after you've watched this video. It's worth noting that before we get into this, we're not going to talk about specific abilities that classes have, because some classes have different stuff than others. Some have more heal over times while others have, shielding abilities. So you can't really specify what heal you can use at any given time because some healers just don't have those available to them. But what this does mean is we can go with the broader topic, which actually should help more people, strangely enough. So let's get down to business. What are healers and what is healing? Well, healers are the people who are keeping you alive, and healers are absolutely essential to keeping everybody alive within a group, whether it's a flashpoint, an operation, or PvP. I would actually argue sometimes healers are more important in PvP than they are in a lot of flashpoints. You can get away without a healer in flashpoints, but you can't necessarily get away without a healer in PvP. As far as operations go, you need healers. It's just, baseline. You have to have a healer. But healers are typically the first role that is taken if people don't want a DPS. Say people come to the game that are either new or are quite experienced, and they're like, well, there are so many DPSers out there, there's so many damage dealers out there. There's not a lot of tanks, and there's a significant amount of healers, but there's still not as much as there are DPS. So which of those do I want to do? People will typically choose healing over tanking, so that's why you see a lot less tanks and a lot more healers of the support roles. That's not to say that healers are easier to play than a tank or DPS. In fact, healers require a surprising amount of reflexes, like really quick reflexes, and healing also is incredibly stressful. So if you have a heart condition, not necessarily the role that I would suggest for you. Healers can also get into groups quickly, so keep that in mind. That's also why people typically choose a healer over DPS. I mean, tanks get into groups probably the fastest because they're the most needed. However, with the healers, especially on a server that doesn't have connected realms, like if you're grouping with other people, you're not necessarily, like in other games, doing it through several servers. You're doing it on one server, so people will recognize if you're a good healer or not, which typically gets you into a group very quickly as a healer. This can be said the same for DPSing and tanking, but it's more prominent within the healer realm of the Trinity. But let's talk about what the job of a healer actually is. And it sounds pretty self-explanatory, and to some degree it is, but there are some little nuances there that you may not necessarily pick up on, especially as a new healer. So the first thing is obviously the thing we talked about before, which is keeping everybody alive, making sure nobody dies. But there's a second part to that, making sure nobody dies part. If someone does die, it is also your job to resurrect them. Some people will help with this if they're not a healer, but most people won't. So all healers have a battle res, and you can use this in combat, so you can battle res people if they go down. This is important. Maybe a tank goes down or another healer goes down. Getting them up very quickly is usually the difference between wiping on a fight and not. But the other thing is, You have to keep an eye out for people who may sneaky res. That's what we call it. People who can stealth, they actually go out of combat for a second and they can start a res on somebody. If they go back into combat, it cancels. So most of the time it won't work. However, you can be pretty clever with this. So keep an eye out for people who are doing that. Usually DPS, good DPS will be the first to jump on that if they can stealth. But this is also usually communicated in organized groups. So if you're not playing in an organized group and you see it happening, see if it finishes. If it doesn't finish, then just battle res the person. It is also the healer's job to cleanse debuffs. Now, debuffs can come at any time, and specifically on certain fights, you'll get certain debuffs at certain times, or it'll be random. So you just have to keep an eye out for what you can cleanse and what you can't cleanse. This will be something that you get a hold of as you play the game more. You'll recognize things that you can and what you can't. And if you're on a new fight and you go to cleanse something and it doesn't disappear, then obviously you can't get rid of it. So let's talk about the role of healing and how to actually heal effectively. Most healers will tell you that this boils down to triage. Now, triage is basically looking at a set of health bars and determining who needs to be kept alive the most in that current moment. Notice how I did say who needs a heal in that current moment, because that's not what it always is. Most of the time, actually, you'll just have to determine what that person needs in that current moment. So say you have someone who is low on HP, but they have a debuff on them. They may not be taking direct damage, but that debuff is actually killing them. So instead of healing them, you just need to cleanse them and then heal them afterwards. There's, a certain, process to how you determine who needs healing and who doesn't. Another good example, someone's standing in a puddle of bad stuff. If you have the ability to pull them, and some healers do, then that is something that you need to be able to do on the fly and know how to use that. Alternatively, this also kind of goes into the idea of not necessarily having to heal the person with the lowest HP, because in a given time frame, say a lot of people are low on HP, but maybe that's because you just took a huge AoE hit that may not happen for another 30 seconds. But your tank is also low on HP, but has higher amount than everybody else. Does that mean that he doesn't need a heal? No, he's probably about to take a big hit, and you need to keep him up instead of everybody else at that current time. Then the next thing you do is you go through the list once again after every heal, and you determine, okay, who's next, right? This actually happens within split seconds within your mind, especially once you get good at it, and you'll be able to do this quite quickly. And this is what I was talking about with the quick reflexes. Triage is the most important part to healing. Knowing what to do in any given situation will completely change the outcome of your healing situation. Now, good triage skills actually require you to be aware of what's going on. And as I said previously, say you just take a big AoE hit and you won't take one for a while, or someone's standing in things. This requires you to understand what's going on around you. So you not only have to be focused on health bars, but you have to be focused on the situation around you. So how do you do this? Well, the first thing is having a good interface setup. This will help most people become a much better healer. And I talked about this pretty significantly in the interface guide that I did within the player guide series. However, let's just touch on a few points in case you don't want to go look at it. The one thing that I've done here on my interface, and this is jumping in on a healer that I've never healed with before, and I've never actually healed in Star Wars. I know, I'm making that admission here, but this is my first time actually healing within Star Wars. So what did I do? I grabbed the health bars on the left-hand side of my screen that I usually have them over there because I don't usually need to see them as a tank, and I move them towards the middle of my screen. What does this do? It gives me 2 points that I'm looking at on my screen at any given time. Now, this actually translates more into 1 point. So I'm looking mostly at my health bars, but my peripheral vision can see where I'm at if I'm standing in anything, where my party is at, where they're moving to, and this is really important. We'll talk about that in a minute. But it also lets me see my bars without actually really ever having to look down at them. I can kind of see what's going on my entire screen by just looking at that one spot where the health bars are at. This may not necessarily be where you would want your health bars, in your specific cases, but this is where it is quite comfortable for me. And this, like I said, was just a quick setup. So maybe it would change a little bit, but the idea is still there. You want to look at the least amount of spots on your screen at any given time, because that makes it so your eyes aren't wandering, which allows you to focus more, which allows you to see more. So the other thing that will help your triage skills immensely is by actually keeping people topped off, which means keeping them as close to max health as possible. Now, here's the thing. I personally hate people being below 90% health if I'm healing. This could be because I played a druid back in Warcraft, and when I was healing competitively, that's what I was doing, and they specifically have a lot of heal over times, so it was really easy for me to keep people topped off at any given point. This may not necessarily be the case for all classes that may not have a heal over time, for example. But the reason I keep them topped off is because in any situation, if you're about to take a lot of damage, the closer they are to being maxed out, the better, because that means that's less health that you have to worry about them, getting closer to death. You don't necessarily want to wait for people to get down to like 30% health before you start actually healing them. Be productive, be healing them as they're taking damage and not once they're low on HP. But this moves directly into talking about overhealing. So overhealing is when you heal for any more than what was needed to get them to max HP. And the higher amount of an overheal that you do, the less effective that heal actually was, and the more of a waste of resources it was. Overhealing is going to happen if you have a heal over time on a target and they happen to reach max HP, and then it's just ticking on them. You can't really do too much about that kind of overhealing. It's very hard to limit that kind. However, the overheal I'm specifically referencing is when you use like a big heal or even a small, standard direct heal on somebody, and it heals them for much more than what they actually needed. You don't want to do this. You want to use your max heals to get them as close to health as possible, or, just barely over that max health threshold. Maybe you only overheal for like 10. Like that would be perfect. But in a world where you're healing for random amounts of large numbers, it's not, completely random. It's not like anywhere from 10 to 3,000, but it is enough where you're going to have maybe several hundred difference in maybe a crit or just a standard heal. So you can't always not overheal. You may just do it accidentally, but the goal here is to get them, like I said, to max health without having to overheal them if you can. And then if you get them to like 95% and they have a heal over time on them and they're not actually taking any more damage, that's going to max them out anyways. You won't have to worry about that. So you want to avoid any overhealing you're doing, like I said, because it actually makes the heal less effective and it makes it a complete waste of resources, especially if you're overhealing by thousands. The very last thing we need to talk about, though, is movement. And it doesn't matter if you're a healer, DPS, or tank. Typically, in a flashpoint or a operation or even PvP, you're probably going to have to move at some point. So how do you do this effectively as a healer? Because it's completely different as a tank. Movement as a tank, you're positioning bosses most of the time, so the way you move is actually different than the way you move as a healer. But there are some similarities. So the first thing is that you want to move the bare minimum of what you actually need to. Say you're moving out of a debuff, you don't want to move like 30 meters away from it. You just want to move slightly outside of it so you're not taking the damage anymore. The thing here is it allows you to continue to heal without having so much downtime. As we said, previously in our hotkey video, when you're not casting anything, when you're not doing anything, you're being zero effective. Even if you have a heal over time or a damage over time on a target, you're still being zero effective in that moment. So you always want to be able to do something. So moving the least amount that you possibly can will allow you to be the most effective that you possibly can. And all of this harkens back to what we just talked to. So, for example, keeping people topped off will allow you to move more effectively because then you're not having to worry about them dying if they're about to take a massive amount of damage because they're already close to max health anyways. So you can move and then quickly go back to healing as soon as you possibly can. But healers also need to know what's going on around them, as we said, being aware because they may need to move. And in order to move out of debuffs or move away from the front of a boss if it's about to cleave or anything like that, even move into range of people who need healing, you need to be aware of what's going on around you. So this all goes back to what we just talked about. And on the same note, we need to talk about line of sight. Line of sight is when something is either attacking you and you move out of the ability for it to attack you. So you either moved behind something and it can no longer hit you because you're not in its line of sight, or someone moves out of the line of sight of your heals or out of the range of your heals. Line of sight can actually be a pretty powerful tool. Say you're doing a flashpoint and you're doing trash and you have a heal over time on a target, your tank specifically, and he jumps in and your heal over time ticks, you're actually going to get aggro for healing him on everything else that they haven't touched yet. So being out of line of sight will actually cause you not to take a lot of damage. This is kind of situational, and you have to learn when to move out of line of sight and when not to, but you'll get the hang of it as you go. And then if people move out of your line of sight, you may not be able to heal them, so you need to know what's going on around you, right? But this goes into the idea of you also need to tell people if they're out of line of sight, because they're not keeping track of this kind of thing. They don't necessarily always know where you are, even though they probably should. So they may move out of line of sight and not even realize it. So if you just let them know, it'll keep them more aware of what's going on within the fight itself, and it'll help you out healing-wise as well. Overall, though, the thing that's going to make you better at healing is actually by just paying attention, because the more that you pay attention, the more that you'll understand what's going on around you. The more that you understand that's going on around you, the better your triage skills will actually be, which means the better your healing will be. And once you get better, you'll probably find yourself being a little bored in some situations. Maybe you're doing trash in a flashpoint or an operation, and everybody's topped off, and you're just sitting there, and you're waiting for people to take damage. It's okay, by the way, to go and do a little DPS if you are bored like that, but just be aware that it's still your job primarily to keep them alive. So if they start getting low, you need to stop DPSing and then go back to healing. But it is okay to do a little bit of damage if that is, what will keep you from being uberly bored in the back just standing there. With all of that being said, I'm pretty sure that covers everything that I'm capable of talking about with healing, but it should give most people an idea of how to get better. And, a lot of you healers probably already know this stuff, so this is definitely an intermediate guide, not an advanced guide. But if you guys have any questions, please leave them in the comments below, and I'll get back to them as soon as I possibly can. And on that note, we shall see you guys next time.